Mr. Chairman.
Sir William Seal.
Mr. Speaker, I too would like to join both my colleagues, the Honourable Ron Mark and Dean Sage, and emphasise the point which I think is very significant in this particular debate. Whilst the Labour Party will be supporting this bill to the Select Committee process, I think it is important for this House to take on board that we need to have a responsible discussion about this. And therefore, I would just caution some of the members of the government who seem to take a gung-ho attitude that somehow the amending the 1987 legislation is going to save lives. And I would just caution that yes, legislation does play a part, but ultimately if we are wanting to ensure the safety of children, it is about people and the decisions that they make and being vigilant about how the legislation is to be implemented. I say that, sir, because the purpose of the legislation is twofold. One, it is aimed at reducing compliance costs, and two, it is about ensuring child safety. Now, when you consider those two aims, it almost seems like you've got to have one or the other. Because the question is, what is a nice to have and what is a must have? And the suggestion by some speakers on the government is that somehow the old legislation did not provide child safety. And yet, my colleagues who have spoken before me have identified that safety was achieved by the old legislation. So let's just be quite clear. The old legislation did work. It did save lives. And therefore, we've got to ask ourselves, how is the new legislation going to ensure the safety of children? That has got to be paramount, because if we're asking what's a nice to have and what must have, I would say nice to have is reduction of compliance costs, but must have is child safety. So that is first and foremost. The other thing is I want to raise is that whilst the bill outlines some significant aims to achieve in terms of, and I'll go through that, child-resistant covers will be deemed an adequate means of restricting access to spa pools. I think we've got to have a responsible discussion about that. And the government, I know, loves to put up the argument that it has to be evidence-based. Well, let's look at what evidence is that will support that child-resistant covers does save lives. It says that councils will be required to inspect pools every 5 years. And again, we've been told that the inspection on a regular 5-year period is important and is going to save lives. Let's have a look at that in the Select Committee process. We're asked also that councils, retailers and manufacturers will be required to inform buyers about their obligation. I'm not sure whether this legislation actually compels retailers. I think the regulatory impact statement suggests that it's an encouragement of voluntary compliance. Again, we've got to look at whether that's going to save lives. The performance-based standards in the building code will be used to specify fencing requirements. Let's look at that as to see whether it will save lives. And then the final one is non-residential pools, such as public school and hospital, will be deemed exempt from the new legislation. Let's consider how that is going to save lives. I do want to also make another point, Mr. Speaker, and that is in the points that I've outlined, which the legislation covers, the one area that I think the legislation ought to cover but does not, and that is the supervision of children by parents. And I'll tell you why, Mr. Speaker. My youngest son learnt to swim at 4 years age. And at 5, he was quite adventurous. And one time he dove into the deeper end of a pool. And because he was such a short person, he used his feet to push himself once he got to the bottom. But he wasn't strong enough to push himself all the way to the top. Luckily, we were there by the pool watching him and cheering him on until we realized he couldn't come up on his own. So we dove in. So, you know, I often observe that in public arenas, also in private arenas, it is important that if children are around water, there has to be parental supervision. I also want to make the point, sir, about safety. Many of us do not realize how important safety is and just how real that a child can drown at a puddled pool, and I've been advised so. But the final point, just to emphasize the safety issue, is not too long ago, I think earlier this week, there was a news item about an elderly couple, and my condolences to the family, who both drowned in a bathtub. And I only raise that, sir, to emphasize that often we don't realize what will happen around water. But I think if we are going to be talking about safety, then that has to be paramount rather than reduction of compliance costs. Thank you.
I call David Shearer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was actually anticipating another National Party person
So was I.
speaking, but I just wanted to say a few words on this bill because I think it raises some issues that have been addressed by our colleagues there, and that is around the actual bill. And I want to mention a few of